Imagine, you are arrested for a murder you didn't commit. You're thrown in jail, where you are beaten by other inmates. You spend more than a year there, and all the while, the real killer is living peacefully in the house next door. This story is about how easily the system can make a mistake and how difficult it is to get to the truth when a criminal knows how to hide. Within any community, even the most tight-knit, people capable of terrible things can be hiding. The trouble is, it's nearly impossible to recognize them beforehand. They look like everyone else. They work, greet their neighbors, and shop at the same stores. The investigation drags on for years. The trail goes cold. Witnesses forget details. And when the culprit is finally found, justice doesn't always have time to catch up. Jessica Beggen was born on May 3, 1979. She had 3 sisters. The whole family lived in Sitka, a tiny town in Alaska, USA. Barely a dot on the map, with a population of about 9,000 people. No industry, no tech giants. The only way to make a living here was fishing, both commercial and recreational. Here, people knew each other by sight. They remembered who worked where, whose kids were whose, and when someone had moved. Men, women, and even children knew how to handle a fishing rod from an early age. They knew their way around fishing. It was their way of life, their language, their means of existence. Jessica knew her way around it too. In the 90s, she was an ordinary Alaskan schoolgirl. She didn't particularly stand out. She liked fishing, yes, but her true passion was cooking. She could spend hours at the stove, experimenting with spices and trying new recipes. She dreamed of going to college right after graduation to become a chef. Not just cooking at home for her family, she wanted more. To open her own place someday, to create menus, to surprise people with flavors. She spent all her free time in the kitchen. Her mother would smile, watching her daughter intently weigh ingredients and write down proportions in a battered notebook. Most of all, Jessica loved baking pies with her mother before Thanksgiving. On those days, they would hold a true culinary marathon. The house would fill with the scent of cinnamon, vanilla, and fresh dough. Her sisters would run into the kitchen to grab pieces of dough. Her father would stop by after work and take a sniff. Those were good days. Her family and friends knew her not just as a talented cook. Jessica was independent. She spoke her mind. She wasn't afraid to argue or defend her point of view. Free-spirited, confident. When she walked into a room, something changed. It was as if more air, more energy had been added. A couple of weeks before her 17th birthday, the family dog disappeared. An ordinary domestic story that turned into a nightmare. The family searched for a long time. They drove around the area, put up posters, and asked neighbors. At some point, everyone gave up. They were tired. They decided the dog wasn't coming back. Only Jessica kept believing. Every day she went out to search. She carried the dog's favorite treat with her. She called its name into the void. She wouldn't let the others give up. She'd say, "She's somewhere nearby. I can feel it." And the truth turned out to be on her side. Eventually, the pet was found. It was a happy moment. The dog returned home, dirty, thin, but alive. Jessica hugged her, crying with joy. Her birthday was just days away. She took it as a good sign, an omen of something good to come. She had no idea that fate had something else in store. On the afternoon of May 4, 1996, 17-year-old Jessica went to her older sister's place, a trailer not far from the family home. The trailer was on a small lot surrounded by pine trees. From there, you could see the bay. They threw a party there for her birthday. A group of people gathered. Friends from school, a few of her sister's acquaintances. The music played quietly. Making a lot of noise wasn't the custom in Sitka. Someone brought a cake from the local bakery. Someone else brought handmade cards. Everything went smoothly. They laughed, talked about summer plans, and about who was going to college after graduation. Jessica was in high spirits. She joked around when people congratulated her. She talked about her plans to go to culinary college. Her eyes sparkled. She felt like her life was just beginning. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had left, the birthday girl looked at the clock. Her curfew was almost up. Her parents would be worried. She grabbed her jacket and said goodbye to her sister. It was about 1 kilometer home along a bike path through the local park. The path went through a dense forest. It was a familiar route she had taken dozens of times. It had gotten dark, but Jessica wasn't afraid. No one in Sitka was afraid. Everyone felt safe here. In their town, the most serious crime in recent years had been petty theft. A bicycle stolen from a hallway. A can of beer swiped from a store. Nothing violent had happened in decades. People didn't lock their doors at night. Children played outside until late. One of the guys at the party, the son of a local police officer, offered to give her a ride home, but Jessica refused. She said it would only take her 10 minutes. She wanted to take a walk before bed, to get some fresh air, to process the day's events. The high schooler stepped confidently into the forest alone. Her silhouette dissolved into the darkness between the trees. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. When her curfew passed and their daughter hadn't appeared, her parents grew concerned. At first, they just exchanged glances. Then her father got up, went to the window, and looked outside. Empty. Her mother looked at the clock. Another 5 minutes. Then another 10. The family didn't have cell phones. There was no way to contact her directly. Her mother went to the phone and dialed her older daughter's number. The phone wasn't answered right away. When her sister answered, there was surprise in her voice. She confirmed that Jessica had left a long time ago, more than an hour ago. She was surprised and alarmed. Why wasn't she home yet? She tried to calm her parents down, suggesting that Jessica might have run into friends on the way. She could have gotten caught up talking with them. Or maybe she decided to continue celebrating somewhere else. Maybe she stopped by a classmate's house. But the explanation sounded unconvincing. They all knew it. The girl had never been late before when she promised to be back. She was responsible, punctual. If she said, "I'll be there at 10," she would be there at 10. Missing curfew? That was something new, something wrong. The parents didn't wait. Her father put on his jacket, got in the car, and drove to the local station. The trip took a few minutes. He went inside, approached the officer on duty, and briefly explained the situation. His voice trembled. The police officer looked up from his papers and listened intently. He nodded. He wrote down the details. On his way home, the father looked from side to side, peering into the darkness between the houses. He hoped to see his daughter walking along the shoulder, to see that this was all just a misunderstanding, that she would walk in the door any moment, apologize for being late, that everything would be okay. But Jessica never appeared. Her mother sat in the kitchen, staring out the window. Her hands clutched a cup of cold tea. Anxiety was turning into fear. Her throat was tight. Something had gone wrong. She could feel it. At the station, the report was taken seriously. Several police officers immediately drove to the sisters' trailer. They gathered all the information: Jessica's description, her photos, what she was wearing, the route she usually took. The sister spoke disjointedly, her hands shaking. She felt guilty. She should have insisted that Jessica get a ride. She shouldn't have let her go alone. Then the police headed to the bike path in the park. They turned on their flashlights. They scanned along the path, peering into the bushes on either side. It quickly became clear. She wasn't on the path itself. No signs of her. No dropped items. No signs of a struggle. Nothing. They widened the search area, beginning to comb through the forest. They moved slowly, methodically. They shone their lights under every bush, looked behind every tree. There were no results. The darkness made everything more difficult. Branches whipped across their faces. The ground was wet from a recent rain. The next day, the search resumed at first light. Volunteers from the town joined in. People came with their families, bringing thermoses of coffee. They formed a line and walked through the forest, calling the girl's name. Silence answered them. On May 6th, everything changed. One of the search party members, a man in his 50s, a local fisherman, stopped by a bush. He leaned down. He picked something up from the ground. A shirt. The fabric was wet and dirty. He turned it over in his hands. He called the others. The shirt matched the one Jessica had worn to the party, light blue with a floral print. They began to study the surrounding area even more carefully. People moved on their hands and knees, clearing away leaves, examining every inch of ground. The tension mounted. Everyone knew. If they found her clothes, she was somewhere nearby. 2 hours later, less than 100 meters from the bike path, one of the detectives, a young guy who had recently moved to Sitka, noticed a strange patch of ground. He stopped. He crouched down. He ran his hand over the surface. The soil looked as if it had been recently dug up, fresh, loose, different from the surrounding ground. He looked up and called his colleagues. They brought a shovel. They began to dig carefully. No one spoke. Only the sound of the shovel against the earth broke the silence. At a shallow depth, maybe half a meter, they discovered the girl's body. She was naked. Her skin was pale, covered in dirt and leaves. A shallow grave. The victim was lying on her side, curled into a fetal position. Otherwise, she simply wouldn't have fit in the hole. One of the police officers turned away. Someone else cursed under his breath. Even without an autopsy, it was clear. The girl had been brutally attacked and had died a violent death. One of the detectives recognized her from the photograph her parents had given them. It was Jessica Beggen, 17 years old. She had been celebrating her birthday yesterday. The medical examiner was called to the site where the body was found. An elderly man with gray hair and glasses arrived. He had worked in Sitka for over 20 years. He had seen all sorts of things: drowning victims, accident victims, suicides. But there hadn't been a murder in a long time. A very long time. He put on his gloves and knelt beside the body. He examined it carefully, making notes in a small book. His face remained impassive, but his jaw was clenched. The medical examiner noted bruises under her eyes and several hematomas on her face. Based on the injuries, the girl had been beaten about the head, several forceful blows. But the cause of death was strangulation. Most likely, the blows were inflicted to disorient the victim, suppress her resistance, and break her will to fight. A large amount of dirt was found in her mouth and throat. Earth, sand, small pebbles. It could have blocked her airway. The perpetrator may have deliberately stuffed it into her mouth to keep her from screaming, so the neighbors wouldn't hear. So no one would come to help. Another theory was that he had simply pressed her face into the ground, holding her there until she stopped resisting. The attacker had no intention of leaving his victim alive. He strangled her with his hands. There were marks on her neck, fingerprints, dark bruises. The killer squeezed her throat with such force that he broke the cartilage in her larynx. It required significant effort. According to the reconstruction, Jessica was attacked as she was walking along the path, almost out of the forest. The perpetrator was likely waiting for her at the exit. He knew she would take that route. Or he happened to be there by chance at the right moment. He beat her immediately to immobilize her. Then he dragged her back into the forest, about 100 meters from the path, far from prying eyes. He raped her, killed her, buried her shallowly, in a hurry. DNA samples were collected from the body: hair, biological fluids. They were supposed to help find the killer. The technology of 1996 already made this possible. The main thing was to find something to compare it with. The degree of brutality and the death of a teenager shocked all the locals. When the news spread through town, people couldn't believe it. They stopped on the streets, speaking in low voices. Women cried. Men clenched their fists. This couldn't happen in Sitka. Not here. Not in their town. The Beggen family struggled to cope with their loss. The mother didn't leave her room for several days. The father aged 10 years overnight. Jessica's sisters stayed close to one another, crying together, trying to support their parents. They stuck together because there was no other way. The only comfort could come from catching the killer. Only justice. On the day of the victim's memorial service, more than 1,500 people gathered at the local church, practically the entire town. People stood in the aisles, on the street in front of the entrance. There wasn't enough room. The priest spoke of life, of loss, of hope, but the words sounded empty. Everyone looked at the closed casket at the front. Everyone was thinking the same thing. Who did this? People wanted to support the family. They wanted to know the name of the criminal. They were confused and frightened. If the killer could do this to Jessica, he could do it to anyone, to someone's daughter, to someone's sister. After the investigation began, residents stopped going to the park. The bike path was deserted. Parents strictly forbade their children from going there, even during the day, even in groups. Never. The park became a place everyone avoided. The police station was flooded with calls, from morning till night. Everyone demanded answers. What are you doing? When will you find the killer? Why hasn't anyone been arrested yet? The dispatchers couldn't keep up, but the investigators had no answers yet. Detectives got to work right away. They organized a task force. They began to look into the victim's immediate circle. Jessica was outgoing and had many friends. Classmates, acquaintances from her cooking club, neighborhood kids. Many of them had been at her birthday party. Among the guests were several boys. They were the first to attract the investigators' attention. Young men, teenagers. Statistics said that victims are most often killed by someone they know. Everyone needed to be checked. They needed to be interrogated, their alibis verified, and DNA samples collected. In addition to questioning, buccal swabs were taken from the young men for analysis. Some agreed readily. They wanted to help the investigation. Others were nervous, but didn't refuse either. They understood that refusing would arouse even more suspicion. Among the suspects was even the son of one of the police officers working on the case, an 18-year-old young man who had recently graduated from high school. He came under suspicion because he had been at the party at Jessica's sister's. She told detectives that the young man had been flirting with the deceased. He had sat down next to her, joked around, and tried to get her attention. The boy was brought in for questioning. He came with his father. He sat at the table, his hands on his knees. He didn't deny it. He had liked the girl for a long time. He had wanted to ask her out at the party. He worked up the courage, approached her, and started talking. But Jessica didn't give him a clear answer. She said she'd think about it. She smiled, but it was a non-committal smile. Despite the rejection, the boy claimed he had taken it calmly. He wasn't offended. He wasn't angry. He understood that she just wasn't ready. Later, as the party was ending, he offered to give her a ride home. He wanted to help. He wanted to make sure she got there safely. But Jessica refused. She said it would only take her 10 minutes. She wanted to take a walk before bed. It was a fatal mistake for her. The office's son seemed genuinely distraught. He was grieving for the girl he had liked. His voice trembled as he answered questions. His eyes were red. It was clear he hadn't been sleeping. He behaved naturally, openly, and this weakened the suspicion against him. But his involvement could only be confirmed or refuted through a DNA test. The boy voluntarily gave samples. He even insisted on it. He said, "Please test it. I want you to find the person who did this." The result came back a week later. no match. His DNA did not match the material collected from Jessica's body. The boy was completely removed from the list of suspects. But the investigation was far from a dead end. The police still had dozens of candidates to check. The teenagers the detectives had spoken to were gradually crossed off the list. Some had solid alibis. They were at home with their parents or at work. For others, the DNA didn't match. The circle was narrowing, but the killer seemed to have vanished. 10 days after the murder, a man came into the station early in the morning. The officer on duty looked up from his papers. Standing before him was a short man with disheveled hair. His clothes were wrinkled, and he smelled of fish and sweat. Richard Binya, 34 years old. He worked as a handyman at the local community college. He carried boxes, cleaned up trash, and did minor repairs. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough for food and drink. He lived on his fishing boat, moored in the Sitka harbor, a small, weather-beaten vessel. The deck was peeling, the paint was flaking. Inside was a cramped cabin with a narrow bunk, a kerosene stove, and stacks of magazines. His lifestyle was almost like that of a homeless person. But it was his choice. It was simpler that way. He was known in town as an alcoholic. He often drank himself into a stupor. He was seen in bars, on benches by the pier, sometimes just lying somewhere off to the side. He wasn't known to be aggressive, a quiet drunk, but when drunk, he could do foolish things, like spending the night in the bushes because he forgot the way to his boat, or falling asleep on a park bench. What was most suspicious to the police was that his boat was moored just a couple of 100 meters from where Jessica's body was found. A coincidence, or something more? Richard hadn't come to say he had witnessed the crime or seen the killer. He stated, and his voice trembled, that he himself might have been involved in the girl's murder, but he couldn't remember anything. He had been dead drunk on the day she died. The officer put down his pen. He looked at the man carefully. He called a detective. According to Richard, he woke up that morning on the edge of the park, in the bushes. He was lying on the wet ground, shivering all over. His head was splitting. He had the taste of bile in his mouth. He got up, looked around. He didn't know how he had gotten there. He walked to his boat, buying a coffee from a kiosk on the way. And there, at the kiosk, he heard people talking. A girl had been raped and murdered nearby, in the park, not far from the harbor. From the very beginning, his statement seemed strange. The man was extremely upset. He could barely hold back tears. His lips trembled. His hands shook, either from a hangover or from nerves. He was deeply distressed by his possible involvement. He kept repeating, "I could have done it. I really don't remember, but I could have." Richard remembered some fragments of the night, walking somewhere, stumbling, throwing something large into the water, as if he were getting rid of some items, or even a body. But he couldn't say for sure. Everything was blurry, as if in a fog. His story contradicted the collected evidence. Water had no role in Jessica's case. Her body was found in the ground, in the forest. No water at all. However, some of her personal belongings were never found. Perhaps the killer really did get rid of something. The detectives exchanged glances. They decided to check it out. They went with Richard to the place where he had thrown something. He led them to the pier, pointing uncertainly. "Right here, or a little further. I don't remember exactly." They called in a dive team. 2 men in wetsuits descended into the water. They searched the bottom methodically, square by square. They only found a couple of empty beer bottles and a rusty can, nothing else. Nevertheless, they decided to take a closer look at Richard. His story was absurd, but what if he really knew something? What if he was trying to hint at something without daring to say it outright? The detectives began to dig deeper. They found out that Richard had a group of friends, similar outcasts who liked to drink. They would gather at the pier, bring cheap beer, and sit until dark. And they had a favorite pastime. They would tease Richard. They read the local newspaper aloud, the crime section. Usually, the incidents in Sitka were minor. Someone stole groceries from a store. Someone broke a shop window. Someone got into a fight at a bar. His friends would always say to Richard with straight faces, "Hey, that was probably you. You got drunk yesterday. You don't remember anything, so you must have done it." Richard was infantile, easily suggestible. He believed it, seriously. He would start to worry, tormented by guilt for things he hadn't done. Once, the detectives learned this from the same store manager. He even brought a fish to the store. He put it on the counter and said, "I think I stole this from here yesterday. Here, I'm returning it." The manager was surprised. He reviewed the security camera footage from the past few days. Richard didn't appear on it at all. He politely explained this to the man and gave the fish back. He escorted him out of the supermarket, shaking his head. Strange guy. When they learned about Jessica, Richard fell for this trick once again. His friends had apparently joked again. They said something like, "You were so wasted yesterday. You could have killed anyone. Maybe it was you?" And this time, he took it too much to heart. That's how he ended up at the station to make a confession. The man had no idea what had happened to Jessica. He knew no details. His story sounded absurd from the start. Despite this, Richard spent several hours in interrogation. The detectives tried to find out the truth. He sat at a table in a cramped interrogation room. The ceiling was low, a single lamp overhead, the walls a dirty yellow. His hands lay on the table. His fingers nervously fiddled with the hem of his shirt. He immediately admitted to having a serious alcohol addiction. He drank every day. Sometimes, he got so drunk that he blacked out. In a state of intoxication, he could do reckless things and remember nothing afterward. Memory lapses were a regular thing for him. The man emphasized that it was his friends who thought he could have harmed Jessica. Richard himself insisted that he had simply gotten drunk again and couldn't remember anything. Only fragmented moments, walking somewhere, falling, throwing something into the water. Despite the unconvincing story, the information had to be checked. The detectives took out the case file folder. They opened it. The man was shown photos of Jessica. He looked at them, frowning. He shook his head. He didn't even recognize the girl. He said, "I don't know who this is." Then he was asked to describe what the victim was wearing. Richard tried to remember. He spoke uncertainly. Maybe jeans? Or a skirt? I don't remember. He gave a completely incorrect description. Nothing matched. Richard knew nothing about the injuries the deceased had sustained. He didn't know her cause of death. He continued to believe he might have thrown her body into the water and she had drowned. The detectives explained, no, she hadn't drowned, but he didn't understand. Despite all this, he continued to feel a sense of guilt. It was obvious. He cried. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve. He kept repeating, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I don't remember, but if it was me, I'm sorry." The detectives continued their investigation. They weren't quick to cross the man off the suspect list. They ran several forensic tests. A comparison of a stranger's hair found on the deceased's body showed no match with Richard. The color, the texture, all different. A check of the male biological fluid also yielded a negative result. The DNA did not match. Then the detectives began to reconstruct Richard's movements on the night of the murder. They questioned his drinking buddies. It turned out that the man had been too far from the park at the time of the attack on Jessica. At that time, around 10 in the evening, he was drinking at the other end of town, in a bar near the bus station. The bartender confirmed it. Several regulars did too. Richard only returned to his boat after midnight. He walked through the park. It was the shorter way. And he had apparently just fallen asleep in the bushes out of habit. He woke up in the morning, heard the news, and decided he was to blame. Despite all these facts, the DNA mismatch, the alibi, the complete lack of knowledge of the details, on May 15, 1996, Richard was arrested. He was charged with murder. Why? Because he had confessed. Because the pressure on the police from the public was immense. Because there were no other suspects. Because they needed someone. Anyone. He spent long hours in interrogation at the station. The detectives pressured him. They said, "You came in yourself. You confessed. Why are you backing out now?" Richard's testimony was confused. He cried. He agreed. He denied. He agreed again. In the end, they got his final confession. He said what they wanted to hear. He signed the papers with a trembling hand. After that, the man was sent to jail to await his hearings. The trial was scheduled for a year later. A long year of waiting. At first, things were relatively calm. Richard wasn't immediately placed in a cell with other inmates. It was a protective quarantine, A separate cell, minimal contact with others. It lasted for several months. He sat alone. He stared at the wall. He thought about how it had all gone so wrong, how he had ended up here at all. Sometimes his state-appointed lawyer would visit, a young guy who had recently gotten his license. He said he would fight. After the preliminary hearings, Richard was moved to a general population cell. 4 men, a cramped space, bunk beds, a toilet in the corner with no partition. The smell of sweat and cheap soap. And that's when the trouble started. The man later confessed that he had been bullied by other inmates. They found out what he was in for: the murder of a minor girl. Prison has its own hierarchy, its own rules. Rapists and child killers are at the very bottom. They beat him. The first time was a week after he was transferred. He woke up to a punch in the stomach. 2 cellmates were on top of him, beating him silently, methodically. The guards didn't come right away. They later explained it as an oversight. He was beaten several times. Bruised ribs, a split lip, a broken finger. Richard didn't complain. He knew that if he complained, it would only get worse. He described this period as the hardest in his life. Worse than living on the boat, worse than alcoholism, worse than anything he had ever experienced. When the case went to trial, his defense attorney tried to challenge the charge and the confession, which he believed to be false. The young lawyer turned out to be tenacious. He prepared thoroughly. He was able to present his most compelling argument when the jury was shown a video of the interrogation. The camera in the interrogation room had recorded everything. The recording showed clear signs of pressure from the detectives. One of them was shouting, banging his fist on the table, leaning in close to Richard, saying something right in his face. Richard cowered, turned away, covered his face with his hands. He cried. He begged them to stop. The detective said, "You killed her. You know you did. Just confess and it will all be over." He repeated this for hours, without breaks, without water, without a chance to leave. The courtroom watched in silence. The jurors exchanged glances. Some of them frowned. Then, a psychiatrist who had worked with Richard after his arrest was called as a witness. An elderly man in a formal suit. He pointed out that the defendant had developmental disabilities. A mild intellectual disability. He belonged to a vulnerable category. People like him are easy to intimidate, easy to force into confessing to anything. The psychiatrist explained, "Richard Beggen has a below-average IQ. He is infantile and suggestible. The detective's intimidation had a particularly strong effect on him. He confessed not because he was guilty, but because he wanted the pressure to stop." The lawyer emphasized this point. He spoke passionately, convincingly. He showed the jury that the police had violated procedure, that the confession had been obtained under duress, that Richard was a victim of the system, not a murderer. The most compelling evidence was the results of the DNA analysis and other inconsistencies. The samples did not match the materials found at the crime scene and on Jessica's body. Not at all. 0 matches. The lawyer held up the papers, showing them to the jury. Here is the evidence. Scientific, irrefutable. This man did not kill Jessica Beggen. The hearings lasted 10 days. 10 days of tense waiting. Witnesses, experts, testimony. Richard sat at the defendant's table, thin and pale. He stared at the floor. It took the jury only 2 hours of deliberation to acquit Richard on all charges. When the verdict was announced, he didn't understand at first. He looked at his lawyer. The lawyer nodded and smiled. "You're free," he said. Richard burst into tears. He left the courtroom with immense relief. On the courthouse steps, he stopped and took a deep breath. Fresh air, freedom. He promised himself and his lawyer that he would never touch alcohol again. He would start a new life. But the town no longer accepted him. Soon after his release, he went to his lawyer. He asked for a ride to the airport. He explained that he didn't want to stay in Sitka. He was sure that because of these events, there would be people wanting to take justice into their own hands. People still thought he was guilty. They looked at him with hatred. They whispered behind his back. The lawyer nodded. He understood. He drove him to the airport. He shook his hand goodbye. Richard flew to Seattle. Then he hitchhiked to Montana. There, he found a job on a farm and rented a room in an old house. He decided to settle down, to start all over. Although this part of the story ended well for Richard, the detectives were back to square one. They once again had no suspect in Jessica's murder. A year of work, a trial, a scandal with a false accusation, all for nothing. Their superiors pressured them. They demanded results, but there were no results. Repeated checks yielded nothing. They went through all of the victim's acquaintances again. They re-interviewed her classmates. They checked the alibis of anyone who raised even the slightest suspicion. Nothing. There was no progress in the case for many months. The investigators were never able to find out who had attacked the girl. No potentially dangerous people were found in her immediate circle. No one was prone to violence. No one abused alcohol to the point of blacking out. No one used illegal substances. The high school student's family continued to hope. Every month, her mother would call the station. She would ask, "Is there any news?" The detective on the other end of the line would sigh. "No, Mrs. Beggen, not yet. But we haven't given up on the case." But their hopes dwindled as the years of fruitless searching passed. The first year, the second, the fifth, the 10th. The case was growing colder and colder. The investigation had hit a dead end. It was reopened several times, when a new detective was assigned, when a new lead emerged. But each time, law enforcement officers faced the same problem: insufficient evidence and a lack of suspects. More than 20 years passed. 20 years during which Jessica's sisters grew up, got married, and had children. 20 years, during which her parents grew old and gray. 20 years without answers. In February 2019, a cold case unit was formed within the Sitka Police Department. A new initiative, a fresh look at old cases. Of all the cases handed over to them, the murder of Jessica Beggen was the most notorious. People still remembered it, especially the older generation. For them, the case had become a symbol of how evil can go unpunished. The team included a young detective who had just transferred to Alaska from California. He immediately told them about an innovative DNA analysis method, genetic genealogy. This technology was already being actively used in California. The method's essence was to compare the suspect's DNA not only with criminal databases, but also with open databases on genealogy websites. People upload their DNA there to find relatives and learn about their ancestry. If even a distant relative of the perpetrator matches, they can be traced through the family tree. By that time, 2 crimes in Alaska had already been successfully solved using this method. Old cases that were considered hopeless. And suddenly, a breakthrough. It inspired optimism. The detectives decided that the latest scientific advancements could help them find out who had raped and murdered Jessica Beggen. To begin, the DNA samples collected during the 1996 investigation were sent to a lab. They had been stored correctly in a refrigerator, so the material was still viable for analysis. The first step was to compare them with existing police databases. The comparison yielded no results. 0 matches. This meant the killer had either never been arrested or had committed the crime before DNA databases were being compiled. The samples were then sent for genetic genealogy analysis. A specialized company took on the job. The process took several months. Analysis, comparison, and building family trees. Finally, an answer came back. The analysis showed a partial match to a man named David Branch. This didn't mean he was the perpetrator, but he was likely a relative, a cousin, an uncle, a nephew. It wasn't yet clear. Further investigation led the detectives to Stephen Branch. David was his nephew. His age fit. In 1996, Stephen was 43 years old. He had been living in Sitka at the time. He worked as a mechanic. But his DNA sample was not registered in any database, neither police nor civilian. He had never uploaded his DNA to genealogy sites. Cautious. Although the investigators had identified a new prime suspect, they now needed his DNA profile for comparison to confirm or rule out his involvement. To do this, they could approach Stephen directly, go to his house, explain the situation, and ask him to voluntarily provide a sample, hoping he would cooperate. But the likelihood of that was low. If he really was the killer, why would he cooperate? Surveillance might prove to be a more effective method. They could watch Stephen from a distance, wait for him to toss a cigarette butt on the street, leave a coffee cup in a cafe, or spit gum into a trash can. Any object with his saliva or skin cells would be suitable for analysis. Before making a decision, the detectives began to dig deeper. They checked Stephen's criminal history and came across something interesting. In 1996, just 2 months before Jessica's death, Stephen Branch attacked and raped an employee of a local grocery store. The victim was 18 years old. The young woman worked as a cashier. One evening, as the store was closing, Stephen approached her in the parking lot. He grabbed her. He dragged her behind the corner of the building and raped her. Unfortunately, back then, in 1996, comprehensive DNA databases didn't exist yet. Criminal profiles were not collected systematically. Therefore, even after he was charged, his DNA was not entered into the system. Stephen Branch worked as a mechanic, repairing cars. He had his own shop in the center of town. His customers respected him. A good mechanic, they said, honest, didn't overcharge. After the young woman told her family what had happened, they insisted she go to the police. She went to the station 2 days later. She was shaking, crying. She struggled to tell her story. The attacker was charged. Stephen did not admit to the rape. He hired a lawyer. He claimed it was revenge, that the young woman was supposedly upset with him about something and had decided to slander him. The question arose, why wasn't Stephen considered a prime suspect after Jessica's death? The perpetrator's MO was very similar. An attack on a young woman, rape, brutality. He should have immediately drawn the detective's attention. This likely didn't happen for several reasons. Violent crimes were a great rarity in Sitka. The officers on duty simply didn't have the necessary experience with serial offenders. They didn't think along those lines. They treated each case separately, failing to see a connection. Furthermore, the rape case had not yet been concluded at the time of Jessica's murder. Stephen was out on bail, awaiting trial. And perhaps that is why the detectives didn't pay him any mind. Meanwhile, in 1997, Stephen Branch found himself in court for the rape of the cashier. He sobbed in the courtroom. He apologized to the jury. He claimed that he thought the encounter was consensual, that it was all a misunderstanding. The defendant claimed he was deeply sorry for the pain he had caused the young woman and her family, that he understood how it had affected her. His voice trembled. Tears streamed down his cheeks. He seemed sincere. The jurors could not determine with 100% certainty whether Stephen was guilty. He was so convincing, so plausible, as if he had become the victim of a deception by the girl he had raped. His lawyer painted a picture. A young woman flirted with him, they kissed, they began to have sex, and then she changed her mind and decided to accuse him. Since the jurors were not certain, the defendant was acquitted on most counts. He was found guilty only of indecent conduct, a misdemeanor. He was ordered to pay the victim's family's court costs, a few $1,000s. Since this was the first criminal incident in Stephen's history, officially the first, he was simply let go. No prison time, no criminal record in the full sense of the term. He claimed it was all a misunderstanding. He promised to change his ways. He shook his lawyer's hand. He walked out of the courtroom a free man. He continued living in Sitka. He worked in his shop. A month after the trial, he attacked Jessica Beggen and took her life. That's how detectives reconstructed the events years later. For the next 14 years, the man continued living in his house. He worked, paid his taxes, had no trouble with the law. He kept a low profile. During this time, he started a family. He got married. A few years later, he divorced his first wife. The reasons are unknown. In 2010, Stephen decided to change his life and move. He sold his house in Sitka, sold his shop. He moved to Arkansas. The climate was warmer there, the land cheaper. He bought a small farm. He got goats and chickens. By 2019, he had a new wife named Barbara. They had met at church. The woman was a widow, looking for companionship. Stephen seemed kind and reliable to her. They married a year after they met. Stephen also had 2 adult children from a previous relationship, Justin and Brittany. They visited their father occasionally. Their relationship was strained, but they kept in touch. When the detectives from Sitka turned their attention to him, Stephen was 66 years old. He was working as an excavator operator at a local construction site. It was hard work, but it paid well. He lived a measured, quiet life. The investigators determined that at the time of the schoolgirl's murder, he was 43 years old. His age, physical strength, everything fit. Now they were certain they were on the right track. However, they needed to thoroughly investigate this man and gather evidence of his involvement in the case. They needed to be 100% sure. In 2020, detectives from Sitka arrived at a police station in the state of Arkansas. They arranged a meeting with their local colleagues. They explained the situation. They asked for help. An elderly man, Stephen Branch, was believed to be guilty of a murder committed 24 years earlier. They planned to gather more information and request a sample of his DNA. To obtain irrefutable proof, they had to overcome bureaucratic hurdles, file a request through the prosecutor's office, obtain a warrant to compel a sample if the suspect refused to cooperate voluntarily. Then would come the comparative analysis in the lab. The police decided not to waste time. While the lawyers handled the paperwork, they intended to speak with Stephen in person, to see his reaction, to try to get his voluntary consent for a DNA sample. By this point, exactly 24 years had passed since Jessica Beggen's murder, an entire era. Technology had changed, the world had changed, but the crime remained unsolved. It was a Sunday, a clear day. The detectives drove up to Stephen's house in the afternoon. The farm was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields. An old house with a porch. Nearby stood a barn and animal pens. The suspect was at home, calmly watching a football game on the couch. His wife was in the kitchen making dinner. The doorbell rang. Stephen got up and went to the door. He opened it. 2 men in plain clothes stood before him. They introduced themselves. Right away, without much preamble, they told him they were trying to solve a crime committed nearly a quarter of a century ago in Alaska. Stephen froze. His face turned pale. He was confused. He invited them inside automatically, not fully processing what he was doing. They sat down at the kitchen table. His wife left, leaving them alone. The detectives took out their notebooks. Stephen looked flustered, but he confirmed that he had lived in Sitka for most of his life until he moved to Arkansas 10 years ago. Yes, he worked as a mechanic there. Yes, he remembered the town. The detectives said the name, Jessica Beggen. Did that name mean anything to him? Stephen shook his head. He said, "No, I have no idea who that is, and I had nothing to do with her murder." His voice was calm, but his hands tensed up. The man even claimed he didn't remember anything so terrible happening in his hometown. The murder of a teenage girl? No, he'd never heard about it. Naturally, this sounded implausible. The local community had talked about Jessica's story everywhere. It was a tragedy that shook the entire town. 1,500 people at the funeral. The newspapers wrote about it for months. To have lived in Sitka and not heard of the case was simply impossible. The detectives exchanged a look. One of them leaned forward. He explained in more detail. The murder was the most high-profile case in Sitka's history in recent decades. A 17-year-old girl had been raped and murdered. She was found in a park, buried in the ground. Stephen continued to insist he knew nothing. He shook his head, and it looked like a lie. The detectives could feel it. He had to have known what happened to the girl. Everyone knew. In any case, they didn't rush to pressure him. They maintained a calm tone. They asked him to provide a DNA sample. They explained it would help eliminate him from the list of suspects. Just a formality. Despite the detectives' calm demeanor and their attempt to show they didn't consider Stephen guilty, he was reluctant to cooperate. The pause dragged on. He stared at the table. His fingers toyed with the edge of the tablecloth. They explained it to him plainly. If he refused to provide a sample voluntarily, they would simply come back with a warrant, and then he would have to give a DNA sample anyway. The law was on their side. Despite this, Stephen refused. He said, "No, I won't." He stood up from the table. He asked them to leave. The detectives looked at each other. They nodded. They stood up. They left their business cards on the table. They said, "We'll be back," with a warrant, and they left. The law enforcement officers got in their car and drove away. They returned to the station and began drawing up the paperwork. Everything was going according to plan. The warrant would be ready in a day or two. Then they would return, take the sample by force. Analysis. And the case would be closed. But the prime suspect was not going to give up. He was not going to wait. A little over half an hour after the investigators left, a call came into the Arkansas police station. The officer on duty picked up the phone. On the other end was a woman. Her voice was hysterical, breathless. She said her name was Barbara Branch, that she was Stephen's wife, and that she had just found her husband on their farm, in the far part of the property, behind the barn. He had driven out there in his pickup truck right after the detectives left. At first, she didn't understand why. She thought he was going to check the fence like he usually did. But time passed and he didn't come back. She got worried. She went to look for him. She found him near an old tractor. The pickup was parked nearby, its door open. Stephen was lying on the ground. A rifle was next to him. A gunshot wound to the head. Barbara was screaming into the phone, sobbing. She didn't understand what was happening, why he had done it. The detectives had just left. What had they said to him? He left no confession, no note, nothing. He just took the rifle from the house, got in his pickup, drove behind the barn, and fired. Because of this, his family had no idea how to interpret his action. Was it an admission of guilt, or just fear of a trial, even if he were innocent? When local detectives and their colleagues from Sitka arrived at the scene, they found a man with a gunshot wound to the head. He was already dead. His body was cold. The paramedics pronounced him dead. The scene was examined. No signs of a struggle. No trace of anyone else. A suicide, beyond any doubt. Based on the warrant they had obtained, it had been processed by then. DNA materials were taken from the deceased's body. A mouth swab, a blood sample. They were sent to the lab for expedited analysis. The subsequent testing took 2 weeks. The result came back in early August. A 100% match. Stephen Branch's profile was a perfect match to the samples collected from Jessica Beggen's body 24 years earlier. This meant he was guilty of the attack on the girl, and for 24 years he had lived with it, raised a family, worked, smiled at his neighbors. Unfortunately, he took all the details of the murder to his grave. We will never know the exact motive, whether it was random or if he deliberately stalked his victims. Was Jessica his only one, or were there others that no one knows about? On August 10, 2020, the Sitka chief of police drove to the house where the Beggen family lived. He went himself, in person. It was important. He rang the doorbell. Jessica's mother answered. She saw his face. She knew something had happened. She invited him in. She called for her husband. They sat in the living room, the same living room where, 24 years ago, they had waited for news about their missing daughter, where they had hoped she would come home. The police chief informed the victim's family they had finally found her killer, Stephen Branch, 66 years old, a former Sitka resident. Genetic genealogy had led them to him. The DNA matched, 100%. Justice could not be fully served. Stephen would never stand trial. He killed himself when the detectives came to see him. He left no confession. He just shot himself. The family received the news with mixed emotions. On one hand, there was relief. They knew the truth. They knew the killer's name. 24 years of uncertainty were over. On the other hand, there was bitterness. No trial. No chance to look him in the eye. No answers to their questions. Why Jessica? What did he do to her? Did she suffer? Were there any last words? Later, the victim's parents spoke to reporters. They gave a short interview. The mother spoke softly, slowly. "We are grateful that the truth has finally come out. But it won't bring our daughter back. Nothing will bring her back." The very next day, August 11th, a press conference was held. The room was packed. Journalists from local publications, several national networks. The case had captured the nation's attention. The Sitka Sheriff's Department emphasized that after 24 years, they had finally managed to solve the crime. This was made possible by genetic genealogy, a new technology that is changing investigations across the country. The Jessica Beggen case became the third in Alaska to be solved using this method. The detectives expressed hope that other cold cases would be solved in the same way. Richard Binga, the man who had spent just over a year behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, also commented on these events. Journalists tracked him down in Montana. They called him. They asked for an interview. The man agreed. He came to a local studio. He sat down in front of the camera. He was now in his 50s. His face was gaunt and wrinkled. His hands trembled, not from nerves, but from illness. He said he still suffered from the consequences of what he had endured in prison, physical and psychological. The beatings had left their mark. The fear, the humiliation, none of it had gone away. Richard was never able to completely overcome his alcohol addiction. The promise he made to himself after his release didn't stand the test of time. He continued to drink frequently, not to the point of blacking out like before, but regularly, to numb the memories. By this time, the man had developed multiple sclerosis. He had been diagnosed 2 years earlier. The disease was progressing. His hands shook. Walking was becoming more difficult. Doctors said stress could have triggered it. The prison experience, the psychological trauma. He was still getting by on odd jobs. He did some work on the farm where he lived, helped with minor repairs. He didn't earn much. It was enough to live on. Richard told the journalists that he had erased his hometown from his life. He had no plans to return to Sitka, ever. It was that town that had destroyed his life. There he was accused as an innocent man. There he was put in prison. There he was beaten. There everyone he knew turned their backs on him. Continuing the conversation, the man emphasized that he was counting on his former lawyer, the young guy who had defended him at trial. Perhaps he would see the interview and get in touch. They had unfinished business. Nearly 25 years later, Richard had still not received any compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. No apology from the police. No financial restitution. Nothing. He had been formally exonerated, the case closed, but no one had taken responsibility for the mistake. He still hoped to fix this, hoped his lawyer would help him file a lawsuit to get justice, at least some partial justice, at least an admission of guilt. The camera turned off. Richard stood up and slowly walked toward the exit. His shoulders were stooped, his steps unsteady. The journalist watched him go, thinking that there were 2 victims in this story. Jessica Beggen, who died at 17, and Richard Binga, who was broken by the system, accused of something he didn't do. And the real killer lived peacefully for 24 years. He worked, started families, raised children, and only genetic genealogy, a new technology that didn't exist in '96, made it possible to find him. But even then, justice was not served. Stephen Branch chose suicide. He took his secret to the grave.